For 3 years, Evan Cole lived inside the Ashcroft mansion as a ghost, feeding the engineers who won awards, saving the software that kept jets from falling out of the sky, and enduring every sneer from a family that called him a freeloader to his face. On the night Mallory's signature dried on the divorce papers and her father threw his suitcase past the iron gates, Preston Ashcroft declared that Evan would come crawling back within a week. He was still speaking when a private jet descended toward the family airstrip, and the woman who stepped off it walked straight past Preston without a glance, because she was there for the man standing outside the gate. Stay until the end to understand why Evan endured 3 years of silence, and what that silence was actually protecting all along. The Ashcroft estate sat on 14 acres of private land north of Seattle, its glass and limestone face lit against the evening sky like something assembled to intimidate rather than shelter. And on this particular Thursday night, every window blazed because Preston Ashcroft had invited cameras inside to witness what he called the most important evening in the company's 40-year history. Preston stood at the head of a table long enough to seat 20, his silver cufflinks catching the candlelight, as he announced that Ashcroft Aviation had secured a letter of intent from Wycliffe Aeronautics, a deal that would move 200 next-generation passenger aircraft, valued collectively at $4.8 billion, and place the Ashcroft name at the center of commercial aviation for the next decade. Beside him, Grant Ashcroft beamed for the photographers and accepted the title of chief architect of a safety system called Aegis Shield, a platform the press releases credited entirely to his vision. No one at that table heard the name of the man who had spent the previous 48 hours correcting a cascade failure in the simulation engine that would have exposed every flaw in the system before the cameras arrived. Evan Cole stood near the kitchen corridor in a gray shirt with no title on his lanyard, watching the room celebrate work he could not publicly claim, and said nothing. Preston saw him from across the room and found it convenient to use him. In front of a table full of guests, he called for Evan by name and instructed him to bring a second bottle of red from the cellar. The gesture deliberate and practiced, the kind that communicates hierarchy without requiring a word of explanation. Grant followed with a remark about how useful it was to have someone around who knew where things were kept, drawing polite laughter from people who assumed Evan was household staff. Evan set the bottle on the sideboard without looking at Grant and turned to Preston directly, keeping his voice low enough that only the nearest guests could hear, and told him the current version of the flight simulation software had a sensor arbitration flaw that would cause it to select incorrect data under icing conditions. Conditions the demonstration route was likely to encounter if the scheduled date held. Preston's expression did not change as he told Evan, with the same warmth he used on clients, that Evan held no engineering position at Ashcroft Aviation and therefore had no standing to raise technical objections in a room full of investors. After the guests left and the staff cleared the table, Preston placed 2 documents on the dining room surface in front of Evan: a divorce filing already bearing Mallory's signature, and a transfer agreement assigning every patent algorithm and technical contribution Evan had made during the marriage to Ashcroft Aviation. Mallory stood at the far end of the room with her arms crossed and her eyes on the floor, and when Evan looked at her, she did not look back. He agreed to the divorce without hesitation and refused the transfer agreement without raising his voice, explaining clearly that North Star Guardian had been conceived, developed, and documented before he ever walked through the Ashcroft gates, and no marriage contract altered that fact. Preston nodded to someone near the door, and 2 members of the household staff appeared with Evan's suitcase and a cardboard box of documents, which they placed on the gravel outside the iron gates. Evan walked out, picked up the box, and stood on the public side of the property line, while Preston informed him from the front steps that he would return within a week. And the engine sound came before Preston finished the sentence. A low thrum from the south grew into the unmistakable profile of a private aircraft descending toward the Ashcroft family airstrip, its tail marked with a silver letter W against a field of deep navy. Helena Wycliffe stepped off the aircraft in a charcoal travel coat, spoke briefly to her aide without breaking stride, and walked directly past Preston Ashcroft as though the stone steps he stood on were part of the landscaping. She stopped in front of Evan, introduced herself by first name only, and told him that her board of directors had declined to authorize the final contract signature until they had spoken with the man whose technical fingerprints were on every meaningful revision in the Ashcroft engineering logs. The air was cold, and the gate was still open behind him, and Preston was close enough to hear every word, and Helena did not lower her voice for his benefit. Preston Ashcroft stood on his own steps, in front of his own cameras, and understood that the man he had just expelled might be the reason his $4.8 billion deal ceased to exist. The interior of the Wycliffe jet was quieter than Evan expected. Not the aggressive luxury of a man who needed to be seen spending, but the kind of deliberate restraint that comes from someone who had long since stopped needing to impress anyone. He noticed an unusual pitch from the cabin pressure management system within the first 90 seconds, identified it as a likely actuator flutter in the outflow valve, and mentioned it to the flight engineer before sitting down. The observation offered not as a critique, but as the reflexive honesty of someone who could not stop listening to machines. Helena watched him do it from across the aisle, and said nothing until the aircraft leveled, and then she opened a folder on the table between them and placed a printed internal audit beside his hand. The audit was a 12-month log of engineering system corrections at Ashcroft Aviation, each entry time stamped against server access records, and a column on the right margin showed which login credentials had been active at the moment each critical fix was committed. Every meaningful correction bore Evan's credentials. Grant Ashcroft's name appeared on presentation layers, design review sign-offs, and press package attributions, but almost nowhere in the functional codebase at the level where the actual work mattered. Helena explained that she had attempted to contact Evan directly on 3 separate occasions over the preceding 14 months, each request routed through Ashcroft Aviation's communications office and quietly suppressed before it reached him. It was only after Marin Shaw, her lead legal counsel, traced a personal mailing address through an aviation conference registration that they learned Evan was living under the Ashcroft roof without a formal role and had been presented with a technology transfer agreement as a condition of his divorce. The offer Helena placed on the table was not constructed out of sympathy, and she made that distinction clear. She was not there to rescue a man who had been treated badly. She was there because the contract her company was being asked to sign rested on technology she could not legally acquire if the man who built it had been coerced into surrendering it. The terms were precise. Evan would join Wycliffe Aeronautics as Director of System Safety, retain full intellectual property ownership of Northstar Guardian, and Wycliffe would fund the remaining development phases under a licensing structure that protected his authorship at every stage. Evan read the contract slowly, set it down, and said he had not yet decided. He was not interested in becoming a weapon pointed at his former in-laws, simply because the timing was convenient for a competing corporation. And his first concern was not the transfer agreement or the public narrative. It was whether a flawed aircraft was about to be demonstrated to investors on a route that crossed the northern Cascade passes in late autumn. Helena slid a second document across the table, a test flight summary from the most recent Ashcroft certification run, with 3 anomalous sensor readings highlighted in yellow and a digital sign-off line at the bottom bearing the name Evan Cole. He had never signed it. He looked at the signature for a long moment, then at Helena, then back at the document, and understood with the particular clarity of someone trained to trace system failures that Ashcroft Aviation had not merely stolen his work. They had positioned him as the engineer of record on a system he knew to be dangerous, so that if the aircraft failed, the liability chain would begin with his name. He signed Helena's contract before the aircraft landed. The story of how Evan Cole came to live inside the Ashcroft estate begins at an aviation systems conference in Portland 3.5 years earlier, where Mallory Ashcroft had been trying for 20 minutes to explain a vibration signature problem to a supplier whose lead engineer kept deflecting. Evan had been standing near the coffee station listening without being invited, eventually stepped forward, drew a quick sketch on the back of a program card, and explained the resonance interaction in 2 sentences that required no further elaboration. The supplier's engineer went pale, and Mallory looked at Evan as though she had found something she had not known she was looking for. His first wife, Claire, had died 4 years earlier in a commercial accident that investigators attributed in part to a cascading software failure between sensor systems, the kind of failure that well-designed arbitration logic could have caught. And Evan had spent the years since developing Northstar Guardian not as a commercial venture, but as a personal accounting with the world. When he and Mallory married, it was Preston who suggested moving to the estate, framing it as convenience for Mallory's schedule and stability for Evan's daughter June, who was 12 at the time and had already absorbed more disruption than any child should carry. He was never given an office at Ashcroft Aviation, or a title or a badge or a business card, but documents appeared in his personal inbox every week, bearing Preston's signature at the top and questions in the margin that only someone with serious systems knowledge could answer. And the answers Evan provided were incorporated into reports Grant presented to the board as his own analysis. The pattern established itself so gradually that by the time Evan recognized it as a policy rather than a temporary arrangement, it had already become the structural foundation of Ashcroft's engineering credibility. 3 months before the divorce, Evan found something buried in the Aegis Shield codebase whose architecture was unmistakable. The variable naming conventions, the redundancy logic, the specific approach to sensor weighting under degraded conditions were all Northstar Guardian, copied imperfectly from a development build that had existed on a shared server during a period when Grant had temporary access. The copied version was missing the arbitration bridge, the component responsible for cross-checking sensor readings against independent environmental models during adverse weather conditions, and its absence meant the system would perform flawlessly in clean air and fail in precisely the circumstances where failure was most catastrophic. Evan told Mallory what he had found, quietly and with documentation, and she promised to raise it with her father, and then did not, and Evan waited, and Mallory kept finding reasons to ask for more time, and 3 months passed the way water passes through a crack in stone. Now he stood in a Wycliffe Aeronautics engineering bay in Redmond with his name printed cleanly on the door of a small office that was his alone, a team of engineers who listened when he spoke, and access to a server environment that no one else could reach without his authorization. For the first time in 3 years, the work he produced had his name on it, in the right place, from the first line. And when he checked the demonstration schedule in the operational database, he found that Ashcroft had booked an airfield and filed a flight plan for a public demonstrations exactly 5 days away. The simulation took 11 hours to build and 4 minutes to break. Evan and the Wycliffe engineering team reconstructed the demonstration flight profile in precise detail. The departure corridor, the cruising altitude, the routing through the northern passes, the atmospheric conditions forecast for the scheduled date, and ran Aegis Shield through the full sequence under ideal parameters before introducing any variables. The aircraft behaved perfectly under Grant's test conditions. Every system responded within tolerance. Every alert triggered on cue, and every automated correction executed at the right moment, because Grant's team had designed the system to work in the environment they had designed it to work in. Then Evan changed one variable, a 2.4% discrepancy between the readings from two independent airspeed sensors, well within the range of what icing on a pitot tube could produce at the altitudes the demonstration route would cross. The simulation ran for 11 seconds before Aegis Shield selected the lower of the two sensor readings as authoritative, initiated a nose-down correction that the flight model flagged as the beginning of an unrecoverable attitude deviation, and simultaneously suppressed the cockpit warnings that would have alerted the pilot to take manual control. Helena asked whether there was a scenario in which the demonstration could proceed safely, and Evan said there was not, but that withdrawing from the contract without documentation of deliberate concealment was also dangerous, because a corporation willing to cover a safety flaw once would simply find a buyer who asked fewer questions. He needed to demonstrate not just that the system had a flaw, but that Ashcroft Aviation was aware of it and had chosen to proceed, which required evidence of decision-making rather than a technical deficiency alone. Marin reminded him that everything he did from this point forward would be characterized as the actions of a vindictive ex-husband attempting to damage a family that had rejected him, and that the characterization would find a receptive audience because it was simple and confirmed what people already preferred to believe. They made the request for an independent federal observer on a Tuesday. On Wednesday morning, every simulation file associated with Aegis Shield was deleted from the Wycliffe server environment, and the system log showed the deletion command had been executed from a network address registered to Evan's credentials. Helena ordered an immediate access review and moved Evan to an air-gapped workstation while the internal investigation ran, and Evan did not protest the restriction. He understood that Helena could not operate on trust alone, and that asking her to do so would be asking her to take a risk no competent executive should accept. Preston held a press conference that afternoon, describing Evan as a disgruntled former contractor attempting to sabotage a transaction from which he had been rightfully excluded, and the framing was clean enough that it carried in the financial press. A clip from the conference, edited to remove the context that might have complicated the narrative, circulated widely, and by evening a significant portion of the business media had accepted the version of events in which Evan Cole was the problem. Helena did not publicly dispute the characterization that day, because disputing it required evidence she had not yet assembled. The week that followed was the most publicly exposed Evan had ever been and the least comfortable he had ever been with public attention. Journalists gathered outside the Wycliffe offices and broadcast questions about whether Helena was making a reckless bet on a man whose credibility was already in question, and several board members sent formal correspondence requesting that Evan be suspended with pay while the situation resolved. Language carefully chosen to sound reasonable while accomplishing the same thing as termination. Helena directed Marin to conduct a full audit of every patent filing, code commit timestamp, and development log associated with North Star Guardian, and she gave Marin whatever the process required, without asking Evan to accelerate the timeline on her behalf. The one document Evan needed most was a handwritten engineering notebook, a spiral-bound technical journal he had kept since graduate school, dense with dated entries and worked equations, which remained in the study at the Ashcroft estate, because Preston's staff had packed his belongings in 40 minutes and Evan had not been permitted to supervise the process. Without it, Marin could establish ownership on the digital record, but could not rebut the claim that the notebook had been created retroactively as a legal convenience. Preston sent a settlement proposal, Evan would publicly acknowledge that several contributions had been collaborative in nature, would withdraw any claims related to North Star Guardian's core architecture, and would issue a statement indicating that his recent public statements had been made in emotional distress, in exchange for Preston instructing his communications team to stop releasing material about Evan. Evan did not take more than 30 seconds to refuse. June called from her boarding school that Tuesday evening, which was unusual because she typically called on weekends, and she told him she had seen the coverage and wanted to know if he was all right. He told her the situation was manageable, and she let him finish before she said she was not calling because she was worried. She was calling because she had watched him spend 3 years inside that house, building things that other people put their names on. And she needed to know why someone who had always told her that integrity was the only currency that actually compounded had decided his own did not count. The question was quiet and without accusation, the way the most damaging questions always are. And Evan was still thinking about it when he agreed to appear in a live technical interview with an aviation engineering publication, not to attack the Ashcroft family, but to demonstrate in front of people who understood the technical specifics exactly how the sensor arbitration failure worked and what a public independent test would need to examine. He was calm during the interview, precise about the engineering, and deliberately uninterested in the personal dimension, and the contrast with Preston's press conference was significant enough that Grant agreed to a public test. Confident, according to a source inside the Ashcroft Communications office, that Evan no longer had access to the critical version of the codebase. That confidence rested on a reasonable assumption, but it did not account for a suitcase. The suitcase was an old one, canvas exterior with leather trim, the kind a man keeps not because it is practical, but because he cannot find a good reason to replace something that still works. And it had been packed in haste by someone who did not know its contents well enough to check the lining. Sewn into the inner base was a flat pocket Evan had reinforced himself 2 years into the marriage, after he noticed that Grant occasionally borrowed laptops for firmware updates and returned them with browsing histories that suggested more than casual curiosity. Inside the pocket was an offline storage drive, 8 centimeters long, containing a full version-controlled archive of North Star Guardian's development history, from the first commit to the build that existed on the day he moved into the Ashcroft estate, time-stamped, annotated, and cryptographically signed, with a key only Evan held. He had said nothing about it to anyone because there had been no need, and saying nothing about a thing you need to protect is the oldest form of security available. Marin spent an afternoon verifying the metadata and cross-referencing the timestamps against external records, conference registrations, server access logs from a university computing facility, emails with dated attachments sent to himself as documentation, before she told Helena they had a clean chain of provenance that would hold under federal evidentiary standards. Helena wanted to release the documentation immediately and go into the test with the case already won. Evan asked her to wait and explained that the stronger position was to demonstrate in front of Russell Dane and a technical audience that Grant had not merely copied the software, but had specifically removed the component that made it safe. Because the story of a theft was correctable, but the story of a deliberate safety omission was a different category of wrongdoing entirely. It was during the hours of preparation that followed, in the quiet spaces between verification sessions, that he and Helena spoke differently, less formally, with longer pauses and more willingness to follow a thought wherever it led. She told him about inheriting Wycliffe Aeronautics from her father at 31, walking into a boardroom where every man at the table expected her to defer to a management committee they had already selected, and responding by restructuring the executive layer so completely that within 8 months the committee consisted entirely of people she had chosen herself. She said what she found interesting about Evan, and she said it plainly, without softening it into a compliment, was that his goal was not to win the confrontation but to prevent the aircraft from flying until it was safe. And that distinction was genuinely unusual in her experience of people who had been wronged. The evening before the scheduled test, a motion sensor alert triggered in the secure archive room where the drive was stored, and camera footage showed a figure in a dark coat who had entered through a service corridor. When they reviewed the image clearly, the face was Mallory's. Mallory had not come for the drive. She said so standing in the corridor outside the archive room, her arms at her sides and her voice steadier than Evan expected from someone who had just been found on a restricted floor of a competitor's headquarters at 11 in the evening. She told him she had come because there was something he did not know, and she had run out of time to find a version of delivering it that did not look exactly like what it was. A woman trying to reduce her own exposure by getting ahead of a story that was about to break. Preston had assured her that after the Wycliffe contract closed, Evan would be compensated privately and given a position of some standing, and Mallory had accepted this because it made it possible to keep working inside a family she had never found a way to openly oppose. She had not known Grant removed the safety module. She had not known the test data had been altered. And she had not known, until 6 weeks before, when she walked past an open door at the wrong moment, that her father and brother had discussed in specific terms how to structure the engineering records, so that if a regulatory investigation occurred, the chain of technical decisions would terminate with Evan's name. She had recorded part of that conversation on her phone. The audio was incomplete and partially obscured by ambient noise, but it contained a reference to a folder called Winter Glass, a name Evan recognized immediately as the internal designation Grant had used for the icing condition test dataset, the specific environment in which the sensor arbitration flaw would manifest. If Winter Glass contained raw test results from the certification runs rather than the edited summaries filed with the regulatory body, it was the most significant single piece of evidence in the entire case. Evan did not tell Mallory he forgave her that night because he understood that forgiveness and absolution of consequence are not the same thing, and he had learned the difference in the 3 years he had spent inside the house her father built. He told her instead the precise thing that was true, that the marriage had not ended on the day she signed the papers, but on the first of the many mornings she had looked at an injustice in front of her and chosen to ask him to wait one more time. He accepted the recording. He did not make a promise about what came after. Helena was skeptical of Mallory's timing and said so, and Evan agreed it warranted skepticism and said that too. And Marin ran a technical analysis of the recording's metadata before any of its contents were used in a legal context. The search for Winter Glass led to a backup server maintained by a hardware supplier that had contracted with Grant's division, the kind of legacy archive that persists because someone forgot to cancel a contract rather than because anyone intended it to be preserved. And when the Wycliffe technical team obtained authorized access and downloaded the contents, they found a record of 17 separate simulation events in which Aegis Shield had lost stable control authority under icing conditions, each one logged, each one reviewed by a user account registered to Grant Ashcroft, and each one excluded from the documentation submitted to the certification authority. The arrest request arrived the morning after they found Winter Glass, not a criminal arrest, but a formal commercial complaint filed by Ashcroft Aviation's legal team alleging trade secret theft, unauthorized access to proprietary systems, and interference with an active regulatory process. The technical affidavit was detailed and internally consistent. It traced a sequence of server intrusions to a network address that matched Evan's registered devices, included log entries timestamped during Windows when Evan had been physically present at the Wycliffe facility, and was filed at 7 in the morning, 2 hours before Marin arrived at her office and 4 hours before the evidence would have been submitted to Russell Dane's investigation unit. Evan's system access was suspended pending review. Russell postponed his site visit, and the Wycliffe board convened an emergency session to discuss whether continuing the professional relationship created unacceptable legal exposure. Helena sat in that session for 90 minutes and returned without having changed her position. She could not publicly defend him while the investigation ran, but she authorized Marin to represent him, commissioned an independent forensic audit of the intrusion logs, and did not cancel the demonstration date. Evan worked from a paper notebook in a borrowed conference room. No system access, no network connection, running calculations by hand and explaining his reasoning in handwritten form that Marin photographed and timestamped at regular intervals. He found the error in the fabricated evidence on the second day. The intrusion sequence used command syntax native to a version of the operating system he had stopped using 4 years earlier, a version he had replaced after a vulnerability disclosure and never reinstalled, but one that had existed on a personal laptop he had given Mallory to pass to a technician Grant employed, during a period when the machine had been outside Evan's custody for 11 days. Helena presented this finding to the board as a technical matter requiring forensic confirmation, and the board agreed to hold the demonstration date. Preston responded by moving the demonstration forward by 22 hours, placing the aircraft in the air the following morning, before the regulatory suspension Marin had been preparing to file could take effect, before Russell could reposition his team, and before any additional forensic results could enter the record. The demonstration flight would carry Grant, a roster of financial journalists, and 8 institutional investors. The weather forecast for the demonstration corridor showed a cold front crossing the mountain passes overnight, dropping temperatures in the upper cruising band by 11 degrees Celsius from the conditions Grant's test scenarios had been designed around. Evan ran the scenario through the offline simulation on the air-gapped Wycliffe workstation, and the result was the same as it had been in every simulation since the first one. When 2 airspeed sensors delivered conflicting data in sub-freezing air, Aegis Shield chose wrong, and the aircraft entered a mode the pilots could not exit without knowing the exact sequence of manual interventions the system's documentation said did not exist. No authority on the ground could compel the flight to abort. The aircraft took off before first light. The cameras Grant had installed in the passenger cabin were transmitting publicly, and for the first 40 minutes the footage was exactly what he intended. Clear skies at departure, the mountain range visible and lit by a winter sunrise, every digital display in the background showing green. Grant moved through the cabin with the practiced ease of someone performing confidence, pointing out the Aegis Shield interface to the journalists with the fluency of a man who had spent many hours explaining a system he had not personally built. At the Wycliffe Operations Center in Redmond, Evan sat beside Helena at a monitoring station pulling public telemetry from the demonstration flight's transponder data, and Russell Dane stood at the rear of the room with 2 members of his investigation team, all of them watching the same altitude readout and the same heading indicator and waiting. The cold front had arrived 3 hours early. The temperature in the upper corridor dropped faster than any model had forecast, and the boundary between the warmer air mass below and the cold layer above created exactly the turbulent mixing zone where pitot icing was most probable. The first sensor discrepancy appeared as a 2-degree variation in computed airspeed between the left and right fuselage instruments, small enough that no automated alert triggered, large enough that North Star Guardian's arbitration bridge would have flagged it for cross-reference against the environmental model. Aegis Shield had no arbitration bridge. The discrepancy grew to 7 knots over 4 minutes, and the system resolved the conflict by selecting the lower reading as authoritative, initiating a nose-down correction to compensate for what the software believed was an overspeed condition. The aircraft's nose dropped 3 degrees. The pilot attempted to override. The system rejected the input. 3 separate cockpit alerts that should have accompanied the sequence were absent because Grant had reclassified them as non-essential warnings during the final cost reduction pass. Grant contacted the flight deck and was told the system was in a protected mode and they were working through procedure, and he then contacted the Ashcroft Technical Center and instructed them to restart the flight management computer, a command that would have cleared the flawed sensor selection by erasing the real-time data log that was the only record of what the system had actually done. Evan was listening on the emergency frequency Russell's team had established and cut in before the restart command executed, identified himself by name to the captain, and asked for 60 seconds. The captain recognized the name from the certification documentation, the version Ashcroft had circulated, where Evan appeared as engineer of record, and gave him the 60 seconds. Evan began to talk, and he did not stop until the aircraft was safely on the ground. He walked the captain through a procedure that had no published manual entry. Because it was a procedure for a failure mode, the published documentation declared could not occur. The Aegis Shield system had 3 sensor inputs, not 2. A third accelerometer embedded in the landing gear bay, installed as a redundant inertial reference during the original hardware design phase, had been disabled in firmware by a software update. Grant pushed 4 months earlier on the grounds that the redundant sensor added processing latency and increased per-unit hardware cost by a margin the business case could not justify. The sensor was physically present in every aircraft. It had simply been told to be quiet. Evan had found it in the hardware manifest during his first week at Wycliffe, noted the discrepancy between the manifest and the software configuration, and documented it in a memo he had not yet shared with anyone, because he had not yet had reason to. The reactivation procedure was buried in the maintenance firmware under a diagnostic submenu that line technicians would never access during normal operations. Evan dictated the menu path to the captain from memory. 7 levels of navigation, 3 confirmation prompts, 1 timed entry that had to occur within a 4-second window, and the captain executed it with the precision of someone who had spent decades treating checklists as engineering rather than ritual. The third sensor came online. Its reading fell between the 2 conflicting values and provided the arbitration reference the system needed to resolve its own confusion. Aegis Shield released the nose-down correction. The aircraft climbed back toward its planned altitude and restored full pilot authority. The fuel burn from the unplanned maneuvering had reduced the reserve margin significantly, and the mountain pass ahead was now crossed by crosswinds measuring 22 knots at the surface. There was enough fuel for 1 approach, not 2. Helena authorized diversion to a freight facility southeast of the mountains and began coordinating to clear traffic and prepare emergency response. Several board members had gathered in the operations center, and at least 2 were audibly arguing for cutting the communication link on the grounds that Evans' direct involvement in a flight emergency without formal air traffic coordination created liability they could not manage retroactively. Helena told them that if they wanted to continue that conversation, they should step into the corridor, because the people in the room were busy. The first approach had to be abandoned when a wind shear event at 300 feet pushed the aircraft 30 meters to the right of centerline, and the captain correctly chose to go around rather than commit to a compromised touchdown. The fuel state after the go-around was critical. Evan told the captain to shut down Aegis Shield entirely and fly on direct law. Manual inputs, mechanical linkages, none of the automated correction that had caused the problem. And the captain, who had been flying commercial aircraft for 26 years and knew this airframe in the dark, said quietly that he understood. The aircraft touched down 400 meters past the threshold, long by any commercial standard and irrelevant to the outcome. No one on board was injured. Grant stepped off the aircraft and sat down on the tarmac without being asked, and the cameras were still running. Russell Dane's team entered the Ashcroft Aviation server room under emergency authority within 2 hours, and when Grant attempted to delete the Winterglass directory remotely from the aircraft, the deletion request was logged before it completed and the directory was captured intact. The full contents, 17 controlled test failures, each reviewed and approved for exclusion by a user account registered to Grant, along with an internal legal analysis detailing how liability would be distributed if the system failed in service, were transferred into federal custody before the aircraft had finished its post-flight checks. The public who had watched the broadcast did not fully understand what had happened in the cockpit, but they had heard a voice guiding the crew to safety, and that voice had a name. The federal hearing was held in a building designed for institutional seriousness, and Preston Ashcroft appeared in a dark suit with legal counsel who had prepared him to answer every question narrowly and with apparent confusion. He characterized Grant's actions as unauthorized modifications made by a subordinate without executive knowledge, positioned himself as a CEO who had trusted his technical leadership and been deceived, and described his public statements about Evan as the reasonable concern of a family that had found evidence of corporate interference. Marin had been preparing for this version of events since the first week of the investigation, and the material she presented did not rely on interpretation or implication. There were emails sent from Preston's account, addressed to the certification submission team, that instructed the team to reformat the test result documents before submission, timed precisely to the completion of the Winterglass test series. There were financial records showing that the cost reduction decisions that led to the disabled sensor were made at the executive committee level, in a meeting Preston chaired. There was a risk assessment document, signed by 3 people including Preston, that had evaluated the probability of sensor arbitration failure and recommended proceeding because the commercial timeline could not accommodate additional testing. Mallory sat in the witness area and answered questions for 4 hours. She confirmed she had received the engineering warning report, confirmed she had not read it thoroughly, and confirmed that her father's characterization of it as an emotional reaction from a departing employee rather than a technical document requiring action was the characterization she had accepted because accepting it was easier than the alternative. She had not participated in the data falsification and had not instructed anyone to modify test results, but her sustained, deliberate inattention had made it significantly easier for those who did to continue without internal opposition. She resigned from Ashcroft Aviation before the hearing concluded and cooperated fully with the federal investigation on the terms Marin had negotiated in the preceding week. Preston was removed from the chairmanship by the remaining board before any legal finding was entered. Grant faced federal charges covering fraudulent data submission, intentional system modification without disclosure, and obstruction of a safety investigation. Ashcroft Aviation itself was placed under interim management, an arrangement designed to protect the several thousand employees whose work had nothing to do with the decisions made at the executive level, and who would have borne the full cost of a bankruptcy proceeding. Helena made a formal offer to acquire the company's assets, structured carefully to ensure that Northstar Guardian was explicitly excluded from the transaction as a condition of any agreement. Evan was asked at the conclusion of the hearing whether he wished to make a statement, and he gave one that lasted 4 minutes and contained no personal grievance. Only a technical account of the warnings he had provided, the responses he had received, and the specific engineering decisions that had made a dangerous flight possible. The Patent Office confirmed the original filing dates the following week. North Star Guardian belonged to Evan Cole in the same clear way it always had. 6 months later, the company was called North Star Wycliffe Systems, and its headquarters occupied 2 floors of a building in Redmond with a testing facility attached, which was necessary because the work required proximity to aircraft rather than proximity to a financial district. Helena held 51% of the equity, and Evan held the remaining 49%, a split that had been proposed by her, countered by him, and settled after a negotiation that took 11 hours, and produced a partnership agreement both of them found acceptable, which they acknowledged was more than most partnerships managed. The intellectual property provisions were unambiguous. North Star Guardian and every system derived from it belonged to Evan, licensed to the joint venture under terms that could not be renegotiated without his consent. Mallory sent a letter that arrived on a Thursday in a plain envelope with no return address, 3 pages written by hand in the measured script of someone who had drafted the same sentences many times before sending them. She did not ask him to return. She said she had understood what she had lost before the divorce was finalized and had spent the intervening months learning to own that understanding without trying to negotiate it into something smaller. Evan read the letter twice, filed it, and found that what he felt toward Mallory was neither anger nor warmth, but something closer to the understanding a person carries for a place they lived in long enough to know its full dimensions. June came to the company launch event on a February morning when the sky was the particular pale blue the Pacific Northwest produces after a week of rain, and she stood on the tarmac looking at the first full production prototype of the airframe that would carry the North Star Guardian system as its primary flight safety architecture. On the fuselage below the cockpit window, in clean block lettering, were the words, Evan Cole, Chief System Architect. She stood there for a long moment and then told him it was the first time she had seen his name in a place where it was supposed to be. Helena found him after the ceremony, when the guests had moved inside and the tarmac was quiet and cold, and she did not bring a contract or a proposal or a strategic consideration. She asked him whether he would like to have dinner, and she said it the way people say things when they mean the thing itself and nothing more. Evan looked at the aircraft on the runway, the one with his name on it, the one that would never fly with a silenced sensor or a deleted warning, and said yes. The jet waiting on the far end of the runway bore no iron gate behind it, and no one standing on the steps to declare that he would come crawling back. It carried his name on the fuselage, his daughter beside him, and the quiet certainty of a man who had finally stopped building for other people's houses.
Where's Lotto?
Wick paddle. Hey, yo. This guy raps
Like
it's
his parents jerked him.
Sounds like Eric Sermon.
The generic version.
This whole crowd looks suspicious. It's all dudes in here, except for these bitches.
I'm a German, eh? That's okay.
You look like a fucking worm with braids. These leaders of the free world rookies looking. How can 6 dicks be pussies? Talking about shit's Greek. Bitch, you could be a piss creek. Wick paddle. This deep is still gonna sink. You're a disgrace. Yeah, they call me rabbit. This is a turtle race. You can't get with me spitting this shit. Wiggity lickety shots. The switches spiggity split lickety. Then I'ma turn around with a great smile and walk my white ass back across 8 miles.